I was 5 years old the day my parents decided I was optional. I remember the floor first. That cold, scuffed linoleum of Terminal 3 at O'Hare, stretching out under harsh fluorescent lights, dotted with black skid marks from thousands of suitcases going somewhere, anywhere, but never stopping for me. Announcements crackled overhead, words blurring into meaningless noise about gates and delays while the world moved in a rush around me. I was small. My name was Nora Kane back then. I wore a too-tight red wool scarf that scratched at my neck, itchy and unforgiving, but I clung to it like it was the last string tying me to something safe. My feet dangled above the floor when I sat. My hands were chapped from the cold, fingers threaded through that scarf so hard my knuckles turned white. Ahead of me, my parents moved in perfect step with each other. Martin and Diane Kane. Their coats swung in unison, their shoes clicking a synchronized rhythm on the tile. They argued about departure times and baggage weight, not once looking back to see if I was still there, not once slowing to match my tiny pace. I could have disappeared into the crowd 10 times over and they would have kept walking, still married to their schedules, their phones, their impatience. When they finally did turn toward me, it wasn't with love. It was with irritation, like I'd become an inconvenience they needed to stash somewhere. "Wait over there," my father said, pointing at the oversized baggage area at the far end of the terminal. His voice was clipped, as if I were a suitcase he needed to set aside for a moment. "We'll be right back," my mother added. No hug, no kiss, no reassurance, just a tight jaw and eyes that skimmed over me without really seeing me. They turned and walked away. I watched their backs retreat, the space between us stretching like something elastic that had finally snapped. People streamed between us, suits, backpacks, crying toddlers, laughter, and then suddenly they were gone in the crowd, swallowed. I did what obedient children do. I went where I was told. I climbed onto a cold metal bench by the baggage carousel, feet swinging, scarf pooling in my lap like a small red puddle. To distract myself, I started counting the suitcases. 1, 10, 50, 100. Bags slid down the chute and thudded onto the moving belt, bumping into each other, going round and round. Owners rushed forward, grabbed them, hurried away. Families reunited and drifted off, leaving behind only echoes and trash and the faint smell of coffee. The noises blurred into a hum. Somewhere along the way, my fingers went numb. My nose stung. My eyes burned, but I refused to cry. Crying was for kids who had someone to wipe their tears. 200, 300. The crowd thinned. The belt kept moving, endlessly carrying lonely pieces of luggage with no one rushing to claim them. The lights seemed harsher when the terminal emptied. The space around me grew huge and hollow like the inside of a shell. 400, 500. Somewhere between 99 and 500, a realization slid quietly into my 5-year-old mind and took root with the weight of a lifetime. I wasn't forgotten. I was left, deliberately. The silence that followed was not just the absence of sound. It was the absence of care. The world around me went on. Planes took off, babies cried, baristas shouted drink orders, and none of it paused for a small girl on a metal bench with a red scarf and no one coming back for her. That silence pressed down so hard I could barely breathe. It taught me at 5 years old that you can vanish in plain sight and the world will keep moving. I don't know how long I sat there like that before he appeared. He didn't arrive with sirens or shouting. He didn't rush in like a hero. He just walked toward me with a quiet, deliberate stride, wearing a simple gray suit that made him look like anyone and no one at all. His hair was a little out of place. His tie was crooked. His eyes, though, that's what I remember. Calm, steady, focused on me, not through me. He stopped a few feet away, lowering himself down to a crouch so his face was level with mine. But he didn't reach out or grab or lean in too close. He just existed in front of me, gentle and solid. "Hey," he said softly. "You okay?" My throat tightened. The word no sat there like a stone, but I couldn't push it out. My body felt like it was made of glass. If I moved too fast, I'd shatter. He seemed to understand my silence for what it was. "My name's Adrian," he said. "Adrian Wells. I've been watching you for a while. Are your parents coming back?" Behind him, a uniformed security guard hovered, hand on her radio. I saw her mouth start to form words, saw her fingers tighten. Adrian glanced at her and gave a small shake of his head, firm but not rude. "Give her a second," he mouthed. He turned back to me. I don't think they are, I whispered finally. He didn't flinch, didn't correct me, didn't offer some empty adult lie about how they were probably just in the bathroom or buying a snack. He nodded once, slow and serious, accepting my words as truth. Okay, he said. Then here's what we'll do. I'm going to stay right here with you until we find someone who can help. You're not alone anymore. All right? I didn't say yes. I didn't have to. He stayed anyway. He stayed when airport security finally did intervene. He stayed when I had to answer question after question from stern adults with clipboards. He stayed through the calls, the confusion, the paperwork that fed me into a system I didn't understand. He stayed when every other familiar piece of my life disappeared. And somehow, over time, he stayed for good. Adrian didn't adopt me right away. The system doesn't move that cleanly. I bounced from one foster home to another, collecting different rules, different faces, different ways of learning to survive. But through every move, every change of address, every new bed that didn't feel like mine, Adrian kept showing up. A visit, a call, a court date, a steady, unshakable presence. He never asked me to be grateful. He never tried to replace what I'd lost. He just chose me. In a world where the people who'd made me had decided not to. He lived simply. Too simply, I thought back then. He reused coffee cans and kept his receipts in labeled envelopes. He drove the same car for years until it felt like another member of the family. Nothing about him said wealthy or secret fortune. He was just Adrian, the man in the gray suit who'd knelt down to my level when no one else did. I didn't find out who he really was until after he was gone. By the time Adrian died, I'd clawed my way through college, law school, and the brutal grind of early practice. I'd worked nights, skipped meals, worn out cheap shoes on courthouse steps. I knew the law not just as a textbook, but as a living thing with teeth. When the governor's commission finally nominated me to the bench, I accepted the black robe with shaking hands and a silent promise that no kid would ever be invisible in my courtroom the way I'd been invisible in that terminal. Then Adrian's lawyer called, sitting in a quiet office with a window overlooking the same city I'd memorized from below. I learned the truth. While he lived like an ordinary man, Adrian invested like someone who understood time and patience down to the day. Slow, consistent, relentless. He'd left all of it to me. Bonds, stocks, property. Accounts I'd never heard of. The total, $5.5 million. It wasn't the kind of money that changes your past. It doesn't go back and hold your 5-year-old hand in an airport or replace the years you spent in other people's houses, pretending not to need anyone. But it is exactly the kind of money that makes the world sit up and take notice when your name appears on a document. For a while, I didn't know what to feel. Grief, gratitude, guilt, even. But before I could make peace with any of it, something else arrived. A knock at my door. A man in a neutral windbreaker holding a large envelope like it might burn him. "Are you Judge Nora Kane?" he asked. "Yes," I answered. "You've been served." I took the envelope and closed the door. The apartment felt strangely small as I slid my finger under the flap and unfolded the papers inside. The complaint was thick. Legal language, polished and cool. It took me a second to focus on the names. Plaintiffs: Martin Edward Kane, Diane Louise Kane, my parents, the ones who had walked away from me and never come back. The words on the page danced for a moment before they settled into place. They were suing me. Their story, according to the filing, went like this. They had lost their beloved daughter in a tragic airline mishap. They had spent decades searching, suffering, mourning in the shadows of that loss. Then, miraculously, they discovered I was alive, and not only alive, but in possession of a large inheritance from a man they painted as a manipulative outsider. They claimed that as my biological parents, they were entitled to the $5.5 million Adrian had left me, that the money, by some twisted logic, was theirs by right. Every word was crafted to pluck at the heartstrings of any judge who hadn't been in Terminal 3 that day. It was a performance dressed in legal formatting, dripping with phrases like lifelong grief and unimaginable loss. They didn't call me. They didn't write. They didn't even ask if I was okay. They just filed a claim on the only thing they thought made me worth returning for. The first reaction that surged up inside me was hot and wild. Rage, disbelief, the aching echo of that 5-year-old girl watching their backs disappear. But I didn't let it touch my face. Not anymore. I understood something now that I hadn't understood then. In the courtroom, emotion is a tool. If you let it own you instead of the other way around, it will gut you. So I sat there at my table, the red scarf folded neatly beside the stack of legal papers, and I let the anger cool into something far more dangerous. Focus. I knew better than almost anyone that the truth isn't what you remember. It's what you can prove. So I picked up my phone and called someone whose allegiance was to numbers, not narratives. Her name was Priya Malik, a forensic accountant with a reputation so sharp that even well-seasoned attorneys flinched when her name hit a case file. Priya didn't care how sad your story was. She cared about where the money went. She arrived at my apartment carrying a laptop bag and a reusable coffee cup, eyes already scanning the documents spread across my dining table. I slid the lawsuit toward her. "I want you to trace everything," I said. "Back to 1994, every settlement, every insurance payment, every suspicious deposit, especially anything tied to an airline." Priya glanced up at me, something like curiosity flickering in her gaze. "Personal?" she asked. "Very," I said. "But I'm not asking you for sympathy. I'm asking you for facts." She nodded once. That was the thing I liked about Priya. She didn't offer comfort she couldn't quantify. "Then I'll need access to any public records we can pull on them," she said. "Property, tax, court filings, the works." I signed what she needed. She went to work. While Priya dove into the past with her spreadsheets and searches, I found myself drifting back to that airport bench more and more. The hum of the conveyor belt. The way the lights changed as the crowd thinned. The ache in my legs from sitting too long in one place, waiting for something that was never coming. I realized with a kind of quiet shock that those hours alone had trained me for this life more than any textbook had. The world had forced me to learn patience the hard way. Observation, endurance, the ability to sit with discomfort and say nothing until the right moment presented itself. Silence wasn't just emptiness, it was strategy. 3 days later, my phone rang. "Come to my office," Priya said. "There's something you need to see for yourself." Her office was all white walls and dark wood, punctuated by glowing computer screens filled with rows of numbers and lines of text. She beckoned me around her desk and pointed to one of the monitors. The document on the screen was old, scanned, the ink faded slightly, year 1995. Case, Kane versus Midwest Continental Airlines. Plaintiffs, Martin and Diane Kane. Defendant, the airline. I felt my heartbeat slow, then pound harder. "They sued the airline," I said quietly. "For what?" She clicked a few keys, scrolling through the complaint. "For losing their daughter," Priya answered. "An unaccompanied minor. They claimed she was lost due to airline negligence. The case settled out of court. The amount was substantial for the time." I stared at the tiny numbers on the screen, the settlement figure, the dates that lined up perfectly with the vague, half-remembered timeline of my abandonment. Priya opened another file. This one carried more weight than any balance sheet. "The affidavit," she said. There it was. An official declaration, signed and notarized, sealed and stamped. The language was dry, clinical, but I felt every word like a slap. In exchange for that settlement, my parents had sworn under oath that their daughter, Nora Elaine Kane, was presumed dead as a result of the incident described. Presumed dead. Not missing, not uncertain, gone. Their signatures sat at the bottom of the page. Familiar loops and slants from old birthday cards I barely remembered. They had traded me for a check big enough to buy a new house, new furniture, new lives. They hadn't just left me, they had buried me on paper. I read the affidavit 3 times, forcing every word to sink in until it no longer felt like it might knock me over. Rage rose, but I didn't let it explode. That would have been a luxury. What I needed was precision. "Show me what they did with the money," I said. Priya's fingers swept over the keyboard. Bank records filled the screen. A large deposit from the airline, broken up and scattered into various accounts. Fast on its heels. Withdrawals, transfers, purchases. Within a year of declaring me dead, my parents had upgraded their lives. New house in the suburbs, multiple trips to Vegas, high-end electronics, jewelry, clothing. They went on vacations that lined up suspiciously well with dates they now claimed to be searching tirelessly for their lost child. And then there was something else, a school enrollment record 2 years after the settlement. A new child, Emma Diane Kane. I stared at the name, a knot forming in my stomach. The timelines overlapped in a way that made far too much sense. They had declared me dead. Then they'd had another daughter to stand in the spot I was supposed to occupy, a living monument to their pain, their supposed tragedy, a built-in alibi for the grief they paraded whenever it suited them. She grew up in that house, Priya said quietly, on that money. I felt something in me shift. It wasn't jealousy, it wasn't exactly resentment. It was a strange, piercing understanding. Someone else had been raised not just in my absence, but in the shadow of the lie that had erased me. The story I thought I knew, that I'd been abandoned and forgotten, was worse than that. I wasn't forgotten. I was converted into currency. My parents had already sold my absence once. Now they were trying to cash in on my life. The irony, the audacity, would have been almost funny if the consequences hadn't cut so deep. They did this to themselves, I murmured. Yes, Priya replied. All we're doing is turning the lights on. The plan that formed in my mind over the next few days was not about screaming accusations or emotional confrontations. It was about letting the law they had once exploited turn inward on them like a slow, inevitable blade. We assembled everything. Copies of the 1995 case file, the affidavit, bank statements showing the settlement deposit and subsequent spending, property records proving the timing of their new house, casino records, travel itineraries, any public trace of how they had used money soaked in the lie of my death. I knew the day would come when all of this would be carried into a courtroom. What they didn't know was what else would be waiting for them there. The morning of the hearing, the courthouse corridors smelled faintly of paper and coffee, the way they always do. A judge's building is never really quiet. There's always someone rustling a file, whispering last-minute instructions, pacing out their nerves. I walked past the portraits of long-retired judges hanging along the wall, my heels tapping a steady rhythm. My black robes felt heavier than usual, the fabric brushing against my legs with every step. Inside my bag, folded neatly, was the red scarf, old, frayed, still warm from my hands. When I entered courtroom 6B through the side door reserved for the judiciary, the space was already filling. At the plaintiff's table sat Martin and Diane. They looked older, of course. Time had carved lines into their faces, softened their features in places, hardened them in others. But the expressions? Those were painfully familiar. Thinly veiled arrogance, a faint, practiced grief. The smugness of people who'd rehearsed their performance until they believed it themselves. Their attorney, sharp suit, expensive watch, perfectly groomed, organized his notes with the calm confidence of someone who thought this was already won. After all, what judge wouldn't feel sympathy for devastated parents begging only to be part of their child's life again? They didn't look up at the bench. They didn't check the nameplate. Their attention never drifted to the side door where I stood behind the partial partition. To them, I was still that child somewhere, lost in the narrative they'd written. The gallery was sprinkled with a few reporters, some curious lawyers with gaps between their own hearings, and a handful of silent observers who seemed to drift into courtrooms like this for reasons of their own. The clerk called the court to order. The bailiff's voice rose, clear and commanding. All rise. Chairs slid back. People stood. Conversations died mid-sentence. The room held its breath. That tiny, suspended moment before the center of attention appears. I stepped up behind the bench. From my elevated vantage point, I watched their faces change in real time. Martin's brow furrowed, his mouth falling slightly open. Diane's eyes widened, jaw slackening as if her muscles had simply forgotten how to work. Their attorney froze, lips still parted on an unspoken word, gaze darting between the nameplate, the black robes, and my face. Recognition slammed into them like a physical blow. The daughter they'd buried on paper 30 years ago stood above them, not on a cold airport bench with swinging legs, but in a judge's robe, gavel in hand. Be seated, I said. My voice was steady, deeper. A far cry from the small, trembling child who had watched their backs disappear into a crowd. We went through the procedural steps, appearances, the recitation of the case name, Kane versus Kane. The dull formality of the record mask kept me exactly where I needed to be, structured, grounded, not swept away. Their lawyer began with his opening. He was good, I'll give him that. He spoke with controlled emotion, painting a picture of two devastated parents losing their firstborn daughter in a tragic airline incident, and then, by some unthinkable twist of fate, finding out she had somehow survived and grown into a stranger who'd been influenced by another man, the late Adrian Wells. He characterized Adrian as a manipulative outsider who had inserted himself into a vulnerable child's life and then cut out her real parents. He talked about blood ties and the natural order of familial inheritance. He hit every note a less informed judge might respond to. I let him talk. When he finished, his eyes flicked up toward me as if checking for a glimmer of sympathy. He found nothing but neutrality. "Thank you, counsel," I said. "The defense may proceed." My attorney, appointed specifically to handle the technical side while I navigated the ethical complexity of this case, stood. He was concise, his voice crisp. He didn't start with emotions. He started with documents. First, we established the basics. My life since 1994, my time in foster care, Adrian's guardianship, the legitimacy of his will. Then came the part they weren't expecting. Defense calls Emma Kane to the stand. There was a slight rustle in the gallery as heads turned. From the second row, a young woman rose slowly. She had Diane's eyes and a version of Martin's jawline, softened by years of apologizing for things that weren't her fault. She walked down the aisle with a hesitant, almost shrinking posture, like she'd spent a lifetime trying to take up less space than she deserved. Emma approached the witness stand. The bailiff held out the Bible, asked the familiar words. She swore to tell the truth with a hand that trembled only slightly. When she sat, she wouldn't look at her parents. "Please state your name for the record," my attorney said. Emma Diane Kane," she replied, voice small at first. "Emma," he continued gently, "do you know who I am?" She glanced at him briefly, then at me. "No." "Do you know who the plaintiffs are?" "Yes," she whispered. "Those are my parents." "And do you know who sits on the bench today?" Emma finally met my eyes. There was fear there. But beneath it, something else. Relief, maybe. Recognition. The ghost of someone she'd grown up hearing about but never really knowing. "Yes," she said, her voice suddenly stronger. "That's my sister, Nora." A ripple moved through the gallery. A reporter's pen scratched faster across a notebook. Martin stiffened. Diane's hand flew to her throat. Emma's testimony came out in layers, each one a quiet indictment. She talked about growing up in a house that was comfortable, even generous, but full of a grief that didn't have a real shape. "They always told me I had a sister who died," she said. "They said she got lost on a flight, that the airline messed up. Sometimes my mom would cry when she thought I wasn't looking. My dad would get angry if I asked too many questions." She explained how the airline settlement was described to her as dark money, something soaked in tragedy. How they justified every luxury purchase with lines like, "We deserve to feel something good after what we've been through." She told the court about the trips, the vacations, the gambling, the timing of all of it aligning with the months and years after the settlement came through. "I always felt like I was a replacement," Emma murmured, "like I was supposed to make up for someone I never got to meet. But any time I said that out loud, they'd tell me not to be dramatic. They'd say I didn't understand the pain they went through." My attorney placed an old document in front of her, a copy of the airline case record with my full name printed on it. "Is this the first time you saw your sister's name?" he asked. Emma swallowed. "No," she said. "I saw it once, years ago, in my dad's office. There was a folder on his desk. I opened it and saw Nora Elaine Kane and the airline's name. My mom caught me and slapped the file out of my hands. She told me never to snoop again, never to bring it up. She said some doors had to stay closed." Her voice didn't shake on that last sentence. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking. Emma's existence, her childhood, her emotional scars were living evidence of the story my parents had constructed around my supposed death. She was not the villain, not the thief. She was another piece of collateral damage. When she stepped down from the stand, she caught my eye again. For just a second, we shared something silent and fragile. Not instant sisterhood, not forgiveness, just mutual recognition of two lives twisted by the same lie. Then came the documents. The 1995 case, the affidavit, the bank records, the settlement amount highlighted in neat yellow lines, the timestamps of spending sprees, casino withdrawals, and resort reservations. the purchase date of their suburban house, falling neatly after the deposit. We laid it all out in the clean, unforgiving light of the record. My attorney approached the plaintiff's table, holding a copy of the affidavit. "Mr. and Mrs. Kane," he said, "for the sake of the record, can you confirm whether these are your signatures at the bottom of this sworn statement from 1995? Martin stared at it first, jaw clenched tight. "Yes," he finally muttered. Diane hesitated, eyes glassy, fingers twisting the edge of her sweater. "Mrs. Kane," my attorney pressed. "Yes," she whispered. "They're ours." "And at the time you signed this document, did you understand that you were declaring your daughter, Nora Elaine Kane, to be presumed dead?" Deadly silence. My attorney repeated the question, voice harder now. "Did you understand that you were declaring your daughter dead in order to receive this settlement?" "Yes," Martin snapped, anger breaking through his composure. "We did what we had to do. You don't know what it's like." He stopped when he realized what he'd admitted. But it was too late. The record had it. The court had it. I had it. They had stood in a courtroom once before and cashed in on my death. Now they wanted to stand in another and pretend none of that had ever happened, as if legal declarations dissolved just because they became inconvenient. The law doesn't dance for you like that. There is a moment in any trial when the energy shifts so completely that even the air feels different. We had reached it. I looked down at the affidavit, then at the faces of the people who had signed it. I thought of 5-year-old me on that bench, counting suitcases. I thought of Emma growing up in the house their settlement had bought, trying to fit herself into a grief she'd inherited but never earned. I thought of Adrian, in his gray suit, quietly standing between me and the void. All of it converged in that one instant. When it came time to rule, the words came easily. Not because I wanted revenge, but because the law, once all the lies were stripped away, was painfully clear. 30 years ago, I said, my voice carrying through the silent room. You made a choice. You left your daughter, a 5-year-old child, alone in an airport and never came back. You then stood in a court of law and declared her presumed dead in order to receive a financial settlement. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. You used that money to build a life. You raised another daughter in the shadow of that lie. And now, 3 decades later, you have returned here to claim rights as parents that you legally and morally discarded when you signed that affidavit. I paused, letting the truth of that hang. For the record, this court finds that you have no legal standing to challenge the will of Adrian Wells, or to claim any portion of the inheritance he left to Nora Kane. By your own signatures, you acknowledged her death for the purpose of financial gain. You cannot now reverse that declaration solely because it is convenient. My hand closed around the gavel, familiar and solid. The plaintiff's case is hereby dismissed with prejudice. Diane let out a broken sound. Martin's shoulders sagged, his previous arrogance collapsing in on itself. But I wasn't finished. Furthermore, I continued, this court has serious concerns regarding the possibility of past fraud and perjury in the 1995 airline settlement. The affidavit entered at that time and the financial records presented today indicate that the plaintiffs may have knowingly misrepresented material facts to obtain monetary compensation. I turned to the clerk. Accordingly, it is the order of this court that the complete record of this case, including all exhibits related to the 1995 settlement, be referred to the state's attorney's office for review and possible criminal prosecution. The bailiff looked at me. Reporters' pens scratched furiously. Somewhere behind me, I heard a faint gasp. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo far longer than it should have. Court is adjourned. The spell broke. Chairs scraped. Murmurs rose. The buzz of voices swelled as if the room had suddenly remembered how to breathe. Bailiffs moved toward the plaintiff's table as Martin and Diane slumped, their carefully constructed lives unraveling in front of the cameras and strangers and, most importantly, in front of the law. As I stepped down from the bench and walked past them, Martin looked up at me. His eyes were wide, almost wild, stripped of their earlier smugness. For the first time since I was 5 years old, I met his gaze directly. You did this to yourselves, I said quietly, just for them. You sold me once. The law just presented you with your receipt. I didn't wait for a response. I turned my back and walked out of the courtroom, my robes whispering softly around me. Each step carried me farther from the child they'd abandoned and closer to the woman I'd become without them. The news ate the story up. Of course it did. Parents declare daughter dead, then sue her for inheritance. It hit headlines, trended for a day or two. Commentators debated. Some called me heartless, others called me a hero. Most people just marveled at the absurdity of it all from the safe distance of their screens. But the media cycle is fickle. The story faded into the background as new scandals surfaced, new tragedies demanded attention. What didn't fade was the weight of what Adrian had left me, and the responsibility that came with it. That $5.5 million was never about diamonds and sports cars. It was about power I'd never had as a child and had barely clung to as a young adult. It was about choice, the one thing no one had given me at 5 years old. I thought about all the kids I'd seen in my time on and off the bench. The ones who aged out of foster care and were handed a trash bag with their belongings and a pat on the back, as if that counted as a launch into the world. The ones who vanished into bad apartments, worse relationships, and systems that cared more about paperwork than people. So I created something. I called it the Gate 3 Project, named after that corner of Terminal 3 where a small girl with a red scarf counted suitcases and learned what abandonment tasted like. The mission was simple and enormous all at once. Support for kids aging out of the foster system, legal assistance, housing stipends, therapy, mentors who didn't disappear, people who stayed when everyone else walked away. Every dollar became a promise that someone, somewhere, would not sit alone on a metaphorical bench with no one coming back. Months after the dust settled, I sat in a small cafe in downtown Chicago with the red scarf wrapped around my neck. Outside, the city pulsed. Cars honking, buses hissing, people rushing by with coffee cups and briefcases and their own invisible storms. Across from me sat Emma. She looked different now. Not in any dramatic physical way, but in the subtler shift of someone who's just started to set down a weight she didn't realize she was carrying. "You know," she said, tracing a fingertip along the rim of her mug, "I used to feel guilty for existing." I watched her. Why? "Because I always felt like I was standing in someone else's place," she said. "This ghost sister who was perfect and tragic and dead. I thought, if I was too happy, I was disrespecting her. If I was unhappy, I was ungrateful because at least I was alive. I was always failing someone I'd never met." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. "I'm not perfect," I said. "And I'm definitely not a ghost." She let out a watery laugh. "I'm glad you're not dead," she replied. "On paper or otherwise." "Me too." We talked for a long time, about childhood, about the stories parents tell to make themselves look better, about the complicated knot of love and resentment and grief that tied both our lives together. We didn't magically become sisters in that one afternoon, but we started something real, built not on lies or expectations, but on shared truth. Outside, life went on. Flights took off. People got lost and found. Somewhere in another terminal, a child probably sat alone, wondering if anyone was coming back. I wrapped my hand around my coffee cup, feeling the warmth seep into my fingers. For years, I thought survival was the goal. Get through, endure, outlast. But sitting there, with Emma laughing softly in front of me, and the red scarf a symbol of something other than pain for the first time, I realized survival is just the beginning. Rebuilding is the real work. I had been the hunted child once, the forgotten girl no one came back for, the name on a file marked presumed deceased. Now, I was a judge, a benefactor, a sister in progress, a woman who had taken her abandonment and turned it into a blueprint, not for revenge alone, but for justice. Adrian had seen me when I was invisible. The law had given me the tools to hold others accountable, and I chose to use both to make sure fewer kids sat in the kind of silence that once tried to swallow me. If you're hearing this, if any part of my story pulls at something deep in your chest, know this. Betrayal doesn't have to be the end of your story. Sometimes it's the opening chapter in the life you build for yourself, brick by quietly determined brick. And if you want to hear more stories like mine, stories where the people written off as victims learn how to become something much more, stay with us. Share what you felt. Tell your own truth in the comments. This is Revenge File Tales. No one should have to face betrayal alone.